Great empires have vanished not with a bang, but with a silent market. Their most advanced societies, connected by vast highways of commerce, simply disappeared from the map, leaving behind only whispers in the sand. This journey reveals a profound truth. Civilizations are not just built on ideas, but on the lifeblood of trade. When those intricate networks fail, entire worlds can vanish. We will travel across continents and centuries to uncover the stories of ancient trade routes that collapsed and the magnificent cultures that faded into history with them. You will discover startling lessons about interconnection, fragility, and legacy that echo powerfully in our modern world. By the end, you will see the ghostly outlines of lost empires in our own global system and understand exactly why their forgotten stories matter now more than ever. How did the wealthiest city on Earth become a forgotten ruin in the desert? What happens when the money for a kingdom literally runs dry? What do you believe is the greatest strength of our connected world, and could it also be its greatest weakness? For centuries, the heartbeat of the Silk Road pulsed strongest in a chain of glittering oasis cities, strung like jewels across the harsh deserts of the Dirham Basin. Places like Dunhuang and Cotton were not just stops on a map, they were worlds in miniature. Here, Sogdian merchants haggled with Chinese officials over bolts of silk. Buddhist monks from India debated theology with Nestorian Christians from Persia, and languages from across the known world echoed through crowded bazaars. This vibrant, cosmopolitan life did not bloom in the desert by chance. It flourished under the immense, protective shadow of the Tang Dynasty, the undisputed superpower of 7th and 8th century East Asia. The Tang military secured the routes, their administration standardized currencies and weights, and their immense demand for luxury goods and exotic ideas fueled the entire system. The Silk Road, in its golden age, was a Tang project. But what happens when the guarantor of a global network suddenly falters? The story of its collapse begins not with sand-swallowing cities, but with a rebellion that tore an empire apart from within. The turning point was a catastrophic internal conflict known as the An Lushan Rebellion, which began in the year 755. This devastating civil war, which lasted for 8 years, bled the Tang treasury dry and forced the dynasty to pull its elite frontier armies from the distant western deserts back to defend the imperial heartland. Almost overnight, the protective umbrella was folded up. The oasis cities of the Dirham Basin, once vibrant and secure, found themselves isolated and exposed. Into this power vacuum marched new forces, most notably the expanding Tibetan Empire, which seized control of key southern routes. The economic dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. As security vanished, the great merchant caravans, the lifeblood of the region, sought safer, more predictable paths. Trade did not stop, but it bypassed these now vulnerable hubs. The flow of goods, ideas, and wealth that had sustained these cities for generations slowed to a trickle. This was not merely an economic crisis, it was a cultural and environmental unraveling. Historians like Valerie Hansen note that without the Tang's organized infrastructure, the delicate systems that made life possible in the desert began to fail. Canals that brought meltwater from distant mountains for agriculture silted up without maintenance. The gradual process of desertification, once held at bay by constant human effort, advanced. The cities did not just become poor, they became indefensible and unsustainable. A haunting example is the city of Nia. Once a thriving center where Gandharan art styles fused with Chinese and local traditions, it was abandoned so completely that archaeologists centuries later found wooden administrative documents, personal letters, and even a preserved ancient broom, left as if the inhabitants had just stepped out for a moment. The sand, which had been kept at bay by constant commerce and imperial order, finally crept in to claim its quiet victory. The fall of these cities forces us to ask a difficult question. What made them truly powerful? Was it their walls, their wealth, or their art? The evidence suggests it was something far less tangible, their connection to a vast, invisible system of support. They were nodes in a network, magnificent but dependent. When the central power that stabilized that network withdrew, their own local brilliance was not enough to save them. Their fate is a profound lesson in fragility, showing how the most vibrant crossroads can become ghost towns when the threads of political and economic guarantee are cut. This pattern of a collapsing core dooming its distant partners would repeat itself across the world, in a place where wealth was not measured in silk, but in solid gold. That golden amber, polished by Baltic waves and carried south by determined traders, represented more than just Roman vanity. It was a lifeline. For the tribes living in the misty forests of northern Europe, this fossilized tree resin was their connection to the dazzling wealth and power of the Mediterranean world. A network of trails and river routes, now called the Amber Road, functioned as a kind of ancient supply chain, funneling this sun-colored treasure from the shores of the Baltic Sea all the way to the workshops of Rome. The relationship was simple and profoundly fragile. The tribes, like the Aesti described by the Roman historian Tacitus, were the suppliers. Rome, with its insatiable appetite for luxury, was the sole dominant customer. This demand-driven economy transformed those northern societies. Archaeologists studying burial sites and settlements find evidence that this trade created new social structures. Leaders emerged who controlled the collection and exchange of amber, adorning themselves with Roman silver coins and glass bowls as symbols of their privileged link to the south. They developed complex protocols and partnerships with intermediary traders to manage this valuable flow. Their entire concept of wealth and status became tied to a market they would never see, governed by tastes they did not set. Then that distant market began to crumble. The Roman Empire, by the 3rd century, was engulfed in a period of intense internal crisis. Political instability, military upheaval, and economic turmoil meant the elite in Rome had far less money to spend on decorative luxuries. As the empire fragmented, the organized, secure trade routes that made long-distance commerce possible broke down. The demand for amber didn't just decrease, it virtually evaporated. The archaeological record tells a silent, stark story of this collapse. In regions like modern-day Poland, sites belonging to the Piazuas culture show a dramatic change. Layers of soil that once held abundant Roman coins, fine glass, and bronze vessels are followed by layers with almost none. The sophisticated local iron production, which likely supported the trade infrastructure, dwindles. What follows is what scholars term a cultural simplification. The complex social hierarchies that the amber trade supported could no longer be maintained. The elaborate burial practices featuring imported goods disappear. Without the economic engine of long-distance trade, these societies retracted, their horizons shrinking from the Mediterranean world back to their immediate forests and fields. Some groups likely migrated, seeking new opportunities, while others adapted to a much more localized and insular way of life. The fading of Rome's light did not just throw the Mediterranean into turmoil, it plunged its northern suppliers into a different kind of twilight. Their flourishing had been a reflection of Roman desire, and when that desire turned elsewhere, their own cultural brilliance dimmed. It forces a modern reflection, doesn't it? How many economies today are built on supplying a single, precious resource to a distant, powerful consumer? And what happens to those supplier communities if that demand suddenly changes or disappears? The story of the Amber Road is a lesson in economic dependency, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing for a culture is to have its fate decided in a marketplace a world away. The desert city of Petra was a masterpiece of controlled scarcity. Its famous treasury, carved directly into rose-red cliffs, was not a storehouse for gold, but a monument to a different kind of power, the absolute control of a smell. For centuries, the wealth of the Nabatean kingdom was built on the trade of two precious resins, frankincense and myrrh, which were as valuable as gold in the ancient Mediterranean world. These aromatic treasures, used in religious rituals, medicine, and as a display of extreme wealth, could only be harvested from the scraggly trees of southern Arabia, in a region the Romans called Arabia Felix, or Fortunate Arabia. Getting this incense to markets in Egypt, Greece, and Rome meant a perilous 2,000-kilometer journey by camel caravan across some of the most unforgiving deserts on earth. The Nabateans did not produce the incense, they perfected the art of controlling its journey. They built a commercial empire not on owning the source, but on owning the path. This was the genius and the ultimate vulnerability of a geographic monopoly. The Nabateans transformed their harsh territory into a fortified toll road. They mastered the desert's one true currency, water, by constructing ingenious systems of cisterns, dams, and hidden channels. They created a chain of way stations that only they could reliably supply. A caravan master had no choice to cross the desert alive. He had to follow the Nabatean route and pay their taxes. Petra, positioned at a crucial crossroads, became the glittering administrative heart of this operation, a city that literally grew rich from the dust. But a monopoly is only secure as long as no one finds a way around it. The collapse of the Nabatean network came from two directions at once, one political and one technological. First, in the year 106, the Roman Empire formally annexed the Nabatean kingdom, turning it into the province of Arabia Patria. While this brought a measure of Roman peace, it also meant the end of Nabatean independence and their exclusive control over the caravan taxes. The profits now flowed directly into Roman coffers. The second and far more devastating shock was the discovery of the monsoon winds. Greek and Roman sailors venturing into the Indian Ocean learned to harness these predictable seasonal winds. Suddenly, a merchant could load a ship at ports on the Horn of Africa, where incense was also traded, and sailed directly to Roman Egypt in a matter of weeks, bypassing the entire grueling, expensive overland trek across Arabia. This new Red Sea route was a logistical bypass of historic proportions. You can see the result etched in stone at Petra itself. After the 2nd century, grand construction projects in the city ceased. The sophisticated urban core, with its theaters, temples, and gardens, gradually contracts. Economic activity shifted north to new Roman-controlled ports like Luke-Combe, where goods arrived by sea. The Nabateans, as a distinct, powerful trading civilization, faded, absorbed into the Roman world. Their story is a classic study in disruptive innovation. They were not defeated by a superior army on the battlefield, but by a better idea in navigation. It makes you wonder, what are the modern equivalents of the monsoon winds? What seemingly unshakable geographic or industrial monopolies today are quietly being rendered obsolete by a new route, a new technology, or a new way of thinking? The Nabateans remind us that the very innovation a society masters to thrive can, in a changing world, become the blueprint for its own decline. And sometimes, the most dramatic collapses happen not when a resource runs out, but when the path to it simply becomes irrelevant. The legend of Ghana was not written in gold, but in the quiet, shifting sands of the Sahara. This was an empire built on a paradox, controlling the most precious metal in the medieval world without ever touching a mine. For centuries, Ghana's power rested on a breathtakingly simple and fragile formula. From the gold fields deep in the forests to the south, gold traveled north on caravans of thousands of camels. From the salt mines of the desert north, life-preserving slabs of salt traveled south. Ghana, positioned perfectly between these two poles of necessity and luxury, controlled the meeting point. The empire's rulers became masterful economists and storytellers, imposing heavy taxes on every ounce of gold that passed through their territory, while weaving elaborate tales to hide the true source from their trading partners to the north. They were the ultimate middlemen, and for a long time it was the most lucrative position on the continent. But a middleman is only secure as long as the route remains fixed and the climate remains predictable. The first cracks in this system appeared not from war but from the sky. In the 11th and 12th centuries, a series of prolonged and severe droughts began to grip the region. This climatic shift was catastrophic on multiple levels. The already brutal Saharan crossing became even more deadly as known wells dried up and oases shrank. The great caravans, the arteries of the empire, faced impossible risks and soaring costs. At the same time, these droughts put immense pressure on the agricultural heartlands that fed Ghana's urban centers. A kingdom cannot tax trade that cannot move, and it cannot rule people who are hungry. While Ghana was grappling with this environmental crisis, the very geography of wealth was changing beneath its feet. New, richer goldfields were discovered and developed further to the east in the Bure region. This gold did not need to travel through Ghana's traditional checkpoints. Instead, it began flowing north along new, eastern routes that led directly to the rising power of the Mali Empire and the burgeoning city of Timbuktu on the Great Bend of the Niger River. The map of power was being redrawn, and Ghana was no longer at the center. Compounding these pressures was a new ideological force from the north. The Almoravid movement, a puritanical Berber confederation, began military campaigns that, while not conclusively proven to have conquered Ghana, undoubtedly destabilized the broader political and trade landscape of the Western Sahara. Their fervor disrupted old alliances and commercial understandings, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already strained network. You can walk through the ghost of this collapse at Come-By Sale, Ghana's legendary capital. Archaeological work reveals a city of two distinct sections, one for the Muslim merchant community and one for the royal palace compound. For generations, it thrived as a cosmopolitan hub. Then the layers of earth tell a story of gradual but decisive change. Imported goods become rarer, construction slows, then stops. The population dwindles over decades, not in a single catastrophic event, but in a slow, relentless seepage of life and purpose. The trade, and thus the reason for the city's existence, had simply moved away. Ghana's story forces a hauntingly modern question. How many nations today find themselves in a similar position? Their economies are built on a single, finite resource extracted from an ecologically delicate zone. Their fortunes tied to global demand and transport routes they do not fully control. The Empire of Ghana did not fall because its gold ran out. It faded because the complex, invisible web of climate, geography, and politics that made its location powerful was irrevocably torn. They lost control of the narrative and ultimately the path. And when the caravans stopped coming, the land of gold was left with only its silence. The sun-baked plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were once a tapestry of shimmering water. A vast, engineered lattice of canals, meticulously dug and maintained for generations, transformed a punishing desert into the world's first breadbasket. This was Sumer, the birthplace of cities, writing, and law. Its foundational trade network was not a long-distance caravan route, but something more intimate and vital, the riverine highways that connected its great city-states like Uruk, and Lagash. Grain, pottery, textiles, and timber moved constantly along these waterways, binding the civilization together in a web of mutual dependence. The prosperity of Sumer was not a gift of nature, but a hard-won victory of environmental management. Its entire existence was an ongoing conversation with the rivers, a conversation that, over centuries, turned into a devastating argument. archaeologists specializing in ancient hydrology have uncovered the slow-motion crisis at the heart of Sumer's collapse. It begins with a simple, unavoidable fact of irrigation in a dry climate. When river water is channeled onto fields and evaporates under the fierce Mesopotamian sun, it leaves behind tiny amounts of salt. Over generations, with no natural rainfall to flush these salts deep into the earth, they accumulated in the soil. The evidence is startlingly clear in ancient clay tablets, which record crop yields. Over time, the records show a dramatic, irreversible shift. The preferred and highly nutritious wheat, which is sensitive to salt, began to fail. Farmers were forced to switch to a more salt-tolerant but less productive and less nutritious grain, barley. Eventually, even barley yields plummeted. The very agricultural surplus that made Sumerian civilization possible, the foundation of its wealth, trade, and population, was being poisoned from below. This environmental decline created a cascade of social and political failures. As harvests shrank, the city-states grew weaker and more desperate. The constant, draining warfare between them, immortalized in epic tales, was no longer just about glory or territory. It was a fight over diminishing resources. Precious labor and materials that should have gone into maintaining the life-giving canal network were diverted to building walls and raising armies. The system of collective upkeep broke down. Silt, the river's gift that renewed the soil, became a curse when it clogged neglected canals, choking the flow of water itself. And then the rivers themselves, unpredictable and powerful, delivered the final blows. The courses of the Tigris and Euphrates are not fixed. Over centuries, they shift and meander across the flat plain. A city whose prosperity was entirely tied to its wharves and irrigation inlets could find itself literally left high and dry, stranded as the river chose a new path miles away. Consider the fate of once a magnificent imperial capital. It suffered the twin disasters of severe soil salinization and a gradual eastward shift of the Euphrates. The great harbor silts up, the canals run dry, the fields turn white with salt crust. Trade routes that once converged on its docks now bypass it entirely. The city did not burn in a single conquest. It was simply switched off, abandoned by the very networks of water and commerce it had helped to create. The Sumerians, as a distinct culture and political force, did not vanish in a day. They dissolved over centuries, absorbed by new powers like the Babylonians. Their story is perhaps our oldest and most sobering parable of sustainability. They were the architects of their own environment, the first to bend a landscape to their will. Their genius built the system, but their inability to manage its long-term consequences led to its unraveling. It forces a deeply uncomfortable reflection. Our global civilization is built upon engineered systems far more complex than Sumerian canals. From atmospheric cycles we have altered to digital networks we cannot see. Are we, like the Sumerians, mastering the immediate benefits while slowly accumulating a debt to the land, the water, and the climate that future generations will be forced to pay? The first to build can indeed be the first to fall, not by sword but by salt. A deep blue stone, mined from a single remote valley in the mountains of Afghanistan, became the ultimate symbol of divine power across the ancient world. Lapis lazuli, with its celestial color flecked with gold like pyrite, adorned the death mask of Tutankhamun and the statues of Sumerian gods. But its journey reveals a network far more intricate than a simple luxury trade. This stone and the civilization that cherished it most, the Indus Valley, tell a story of a connection so vital that when it was severed, an entire world of ideas faded from history. The great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were hubs in a vast Bronze Age exchange system. They did not just trade goods, they traded in meaning. Lapis lazuli, along with carnelian from Gujarat and tin from distant sources, were materials charged with cultural and religious significance. Possessing them was a statement of participation in a shared, elite international culture that stretched from the Indus to the Euphrates. This symbolic trade, as some scholars describe it, was a glue binding distant civilizations in a mutual recognition of status and sophistication. The vibrancy of the Indus civilization, with its stunning urban planning, standardized bricks, and enigmatic script, was sustained by these far-reaching connections. Its decline, therefore, is a mystery best understood not by looking for a single invading army, but by tracing the fraying of those threads. Around 1900 BCE, the interconnected system began to fail. The Mesopotamian world, a primary trade partner, entered a period of significant political fragmentation and economic contraction. The demand for Indus Valley exports, like finely drilled carnelian beads and perhaps early cotton textiles, likely plummeted. At the same time, environmental changes were reshaping the Indus heartland itself. Research suggests the crucial Gagga-Hakra river system, which supported many settlements, began to dry up, a process possibly linked to broader climate shifts. This had a double impact. It disrupted the agricultural base that fed the urban populations, and it crippled the internal waterways used to transport goods to ports for long-distance trade. The evidence of collapse is written in the quiet abandonment of standardized systems. The meticulously uniform weights and measures, essential for complex commerce, disappear from the archaeological record. The elegant, undeciphered Indus script, which may have served administrative and trade purposes, falls completely out of use when the long-distance exchanges that required such precise administration became no longer viable. The need for the bureaucracy itself evaporated. The civilization did not end in a sudden catastrophe. It underwent a profound transformation. People likely migrated eastward toward the more reliable waters of the Ganges basin, settling in smaller, more localized communities. The grand urban vision, the shared symbols, the very idea of a unified Harappan identity, could not survive the disintegration of the web that sustained it. Their world vanished not because they forgot how to build cities, but because the conversations they were having with the wider world fell silent. This invites a powerful reflection on our own global culture. What symbols, arts, or even technologies do we cherish today that are entirely dependent on a fragile network of global exchange? How much of our shared modern identity is sustained not by local tradition, but by constant, invisible threads of connection that we simply take for granted? The story of the Indus and its blue stone is a testament to the beauty of connection and a silent warning about the fragility of a world built upon it. The true color of ancient power was not gold, but a deep, vibrant purple. To produce just a single gram of this legendary Tyrian purple, dye required the careful extraction of a gland from thousands of a specific sea snail, the murex. The process was notoriously foul-smelling and staggeringly expensive, which was precisely the point. This dye became the ultimate status symbol, a color legally restricted to royalty and the highest elites across the Mediterranean and Near East. The masterminds behind this exclusive trade were the Phoenicians, a civilization of unparalleled mariners who built their identity not on vast inland empires, but on a network of coastal city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Their wealth flowed from niche luxury manufacturing, turning the sea's resources into objects of immense desire. They were not just traders, they were cultural conduits, most famously spreading a revolutionary technology, the phonetic alphabet, which would form the basis for Greek and later Latin scripts. Their network was a string of independent mercantile republics connected by the sea and a shared commercial genius. Yet this very model, built on specialized crafts and maritime agility, contained the seeds of its own dissolution. The first major pressure came from the relentless expansion of land-based empires. The Assyrians and later the Babylonians viewed the wealthy Phoenician cities not as enemies to be destroyed, but as treasuries to be tapped. They imposed crushing annual tributes demanding gold, timber, and of course the priceless purple cloth. This financial drain slowly eroded the city's autonomy, forcing them to become compliant suppliers to imperial courts rather than independent masters of their own fate. Even more insidiously, the core industry itself faced a slow burn crisis. While evidence is debated, some maritime historians suggest the possibility of overharvesting. The murex snail populations, relentlessly gathered to meet endless imperial demand, may have dwindled around key production centers, making the legendary dye even rarer and more costly to produce. Political end came not from the east but from the west and from within their own family. The great Phoenician colony of Carthage in North Africa grew so powerful it essentially became a rival empire, overshadowing and sometimes conflicting with its mother cities. The final, symbolic blow fell in 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great laid siege to the island city of Tyre. In a stunning feat of military engineering, he built a massive causeway to reach the seemingly impregnable walls, captured the city, and broke its power forever. Later, under the Roman Empire, the remaining Phoenician centers were fully absorbed. The Romans, ever efficient, systematized the purple dye industry, placing it under imperial control. Cities like Sidon continued to exist, even thrive, but they did so as Roman provincial towns. Their unique identity as fiercely independent, seafaring merchant republics was gone, co-opted and streamlined by a larger machine. The Phoenicians ceased to be a distinct civilization the moment their specialized economic niche was swallowed by empires. Their legacy lived on in the alphabet, in artistic motifs, and in the maritime knowledge they spread, but their political and cultural sovereignty did not. This raises a poignant question for our own time. What unique cultural industries or artisanal brands define a community's identity today? And how vulnerable are those treasures to the pressures of global acquisition, environmental limits, or simply being absorbed into a homogenizing system where their original meaning is lost? The story of the purple dye is a lesson in how empires can consume not just territory, but the very soul of a specialized craft, leaving the shell of a city behind while its heart stops beating. That profound sense of cultural loss echoes across another ocean, in the humid jungles of ancient Mesoamerica. Here, the most valued substance was not a metal, but a stone, a translucent green jade that captured the very essence of life. Long before the pyramids of the classic Maya rose, a sophisticated trade in this sacred material connected distant peoples into a shared world of meaning. This was the Jade Road, a network where commerce and cosmology were inseparable. To hold an Olmec jade celt, a polished axe-shaped object carved with the snarling image of a word jaguar, was not just to own a beautiful object. It was to hold a piece of a mountain, a fragment of the life-giving storm, a physical piece of a belief system. Archaeologists who study these objects explain that jade's color and coolness directly symbolized water, maize, fertility, and breath, the fundamental forces of existence. Trading it, therefore, was not a mercantile act but a sacred one, a ritual that reinforced a common ideological vision across a vast landscape. The Olmecs, often called Mesoamerica's mother culture, sat at the heart of this early network. Their major centers, like La Venta, were consumers and artistic innovators, transforming raw jade from mines in the Motagua River Valley of Guatemala into powerful symbols that defined elite authority and spiritual power. Their distinctive art style, featuring those iconic colossal heads and supernatural beings, spread along the same routes as the jade itself. For centuries, this system created a kind of cosmological unity, binding highland miners and lowland rulers in a mutually understood dialogue of stone and spirit. Then, around 400 BCE, the Olmec heartland entered a period of decline. The great centers were gradually abandoned. The reasons are complex and still debated, involving possible environmental shifts, including volcanic activity that altered local river systems, making transportation and agriculture more challenging. But the critical point for our story is the network effect. When the primary cultural engine, the Olmecs, ceased to demand and distribute jade in the same way, the entire ideological circuit faltered. The trade routes did not vanish, but their purpose and destination shifted dramatically. New powers arose with different priorities. In the valley of Oaxaca, the Zapotecs built the magnificent hilltop city of Monte Alban. While they used jade, their growing empire was cemented through different means, like military expansion and a writing system focused on conquest and genealogy. Their trade networks looked in other directions. Meanwhile, in the Maya region, the geography of importance changed. Sites like Kaminaljuyu, located strategically near the precious jade sources, grew immensely powerful during the ensuing pre-classic period. They controlled the supply, becoming the new brokers of this sacred commodity for the rising Maya elites. The older Olmec-influenced centers, once the proud endpoints of the journey, lost their gravitational pull. The unifying ideology that the Olmecs had propagated fragmented and was repurposed. There were jaguar motif and reverence for jade were absorbed and transformed by the Maya and others, becoming elements in a new, more diverse tapestry of belief. The Olmecs as a dominant political force vanished, in large part because the network that broadcast their identity and unified their world first contracted, and then was rewired by others. This makes us wonder about our own ideological networks. What shared beliefs or cultural concepts today are spread not by conquest, but by a kind of voluntary trade through film, art, or digital media? And what happens to our sense of common understanding if those channels of symbolic exchange are suddenly disrupted or redirected? The story of the Jade Road reveals that sometimes a civilization ends not when its cities fall, but when the conversations that gave its symbols meaning simply find new speakers. The most vital trade route in the ancient world carried no silk, no spices, and no gold. Its cargo was simple grain, and its purpose was not profit but survival. For centuries, the stability of Rome, a city of over 1 million people, hinged on a single, staggering logistical feat. Every year, a fleet of massive cargo ships known as corbetti would set sail from the ports of Carthage and Alexandria. Their holds were packed not with luxuries but with the humble wheat that was the lifeblood of the empire's heart. This was the annona, the state-controlled grain supply, and it created a system of breathtaking vulnerability. Rome had grown into a metropolis that could not feed itself, a political giant that was biologically dependent on provinces an ocean away. Economic historians note this system fundamentally reshaped entire regions. North Africa and Egypt were transformed into vast, export-oriented monocultures. Local farmers were incentivized, often through imperial policy, to grow grain and olive oil for Rome, rather than a diverse range of crops for their own communities. The wealth generated built magnificent cities like Leptis Magna in Libya, with its grand arches and sprawling marketplaces funded entirely by the agricultural trade. But this created a brittle, one-way flow of energy. The prosperity of the provinces was tied directly to the appetite of a single, distant city. The collapse of this network was not a single event, but a cascade of failures that severed the circuit. In the 5th century, the Vandal conquest seized control of the crucial North African breadbasket. This was not just a military loss, it was an economic amputation. The regular grain fleets from Carthage simply stopped arriving. Compounding this, the Roman navy and the merchant marine that had guaranteed safe passage across the Mediterranean had deteriorated. Piracy resurfaced, and the complex system of state financing and insurance that underpinned such massive shipments broke down. Without security and capital, long-distance bulk transport of a cheap commodity like grain became impossible. The impact on Rome was immediate and devastating. The loss of the free grain dole meant hunger for the vast population of urban poor who relied on it. This contributed to severe social unrest and a rapid depopulation, as people left the city in search of food and opportunity elsewhere. The Western Roman Empire, as a political structure, did not just fade from abstract political weakness, it withered because the economic circuit that sustained its colossal heart was cut. You can walk through the ghost of this system at Leptis Magna. After the Vandal takeover, the grand city did not burn, it simply stopped. Construction on its monumental projects halted mid-strand. The bustling port silted up without constant dredging. The money and the reason for its extravagant beauty had vanished with the last grain ship bound for Rome. This forces a starkly modern reflection. How many of our great cities today are in a similar, though more complex, position? Our megacities are fed, powered, and supplied by intricate global chains that bring food from continents away, fuel from unstable regions, and components from specialized factories across the globe. We have built a world of incredible efficiency, but also of profound interdependence. The Roman grain network shows us that the greatest threat to a civilization can sometimes be the quiet silence of an empty harbor, and the realization that the bread on your table traveled 1,000 miles over a sea you no longer control. Behind the towering walls of Constantinople, a secret more valuable than gold was cultivated in silence. In heavily guarded imperial workshops, workers tended to the only silkworms in the Western world, a monopoly secured through daring espionage and maintained by absolute imperial control. The Byzantine Empire, the heir to Rome in the East, had transformed a luxury into a strategic weapon. Their control over silk production funded Emperor Justinian's grand ambitions, his wars to reclaim Italy and North Africa, and his crowning architectural achievement, the magnificent Hagia Sophia. This was not merely trade, it was a state-run engine of power, a controlled network designed to funnel wealth directly into the imperial treasury. But the most sophisticated human systems are powerless against a microscopic enemy. In the year 541, a biological disaster arrived in the empire's bustling ports, carried by rats on grain ships from Egypt. The Plague of Justinian, now believed to be an early form of bubonic plague, swept through the densely populated cities and fertile countryside with terrifying speed. Contemporary accounts describe a staggering loss of life, with modern historians estimating perhaps a quarter of the entire empire's population perished in repeated waves over the next 2 decades. The impact was a systemic collapse. The tax base, which relied on a healthy population of farmers and artisans, evaporated. The ranks of the mighty Roman army, already stretched thin by Justinian's costly wars, were decimated. Most critically for the silk monopoly, the specialized labor force required for the delicate, multi-stage process of sericulture, from tending mulberry trees to weaving the final fabric, was simply gone. The disease did not just take lives, it severed connections. Ports imposed desperate quarantines, bringing maritime trade to a standstill. Merchants and sailors, the vital links in any commercial network, fell ill and died, leaving goods to rot on docks and contracts unfulfilled. The great city of Antioch, a pivotal commercial hub, embodies this double catastrophe. It was brutally sacked by the Persian Empire in 540, then struck by the plague immediately after. Once a thriving center of exchange, it never recovered its former economic glory, its grand colonnaded streets echoing with a fraction of their former activity. In this weakened, hollowed-out state, the Byzantine Empire could no longer defend its economic frontiers. First the Persians, and then the explosive expansion of the Arab Caliphate in the 7th century, captured key territories and overland trade routes. The Arabs soon learned the secrets of silk production themselves, breaking the Byzantine monopoly for good. The empire survived, but it was permanently diminished, its wealth and influence fractured. This story forces a chilling reflection on control and vulnerability. The Byzantines had built the perfect closed system, a trade network guarded by law, secrecy, and military might. Yet it was shattered not by a superior army or a better business model, but by a force of nature they could not see, predict, or defend against. It asks us, in our own interconnected age, what meticulously controlled systems do we rely on today? And how would they fare against a shock that bypasses all our human-made defenses, targeting the very people who make the system function? The Byzantine experience is a sobering lesson in humility, reminding us that the threads of commerce, no matter how strong, are woven by human hands and are only as resilient as the communities that hold them. The sound of silver in a Scandinavian grave was a whisper from a world away. A Viking chieftain buried on the island of Gotland might be laid to rest with a hoard of coins, each stamped with elegant Arabic script proclaiming the oneness of God. These were dirhams, the currency of the Abbasid Caliphate, and their journey to the north tells the story of one of history's most daring and brutal economic networks. For over 2 centuries, Norse adventurers known as the Rus navigated the treacherous river systems of Eastern Europe, dragging their longships from the Baltic to the Volga and down to the Caspian Sea. Their cargo heading south was the wealth of the northern forests, fine furs, amber, honey, and wax. But their most tragic and profitable commodity was human beings, captives taken in raids and sold in the slave markets of Baghdad and Constantinople. The return cargo was silver, vast quantities of it minted into dirhams. This influx of precious metal did more than make individuals rich. It transformed entire societies back in Scandinavia. Numismatists, scientists who study coins, can trace this transformation in the soil. Early Viking Age sites in Sweden and Denmark show few coins, then a sudden, massive influx of dirhams in the 9th and 10th centuries. This silver became the lifeblood of a new kind of economy, a bullion economy. Wealth was not just held in land or cattle, but in portable, measurable silver, which could be melted down into arm rings or chopped into pieces for smaller transactions. This liquidity fueled social complexity, funding the retinues of powerful jarls, building trading towns, and financing the very ships that went on more raids and trading expeditions. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion powered by silver. Then the silver stopped, beginning in the late 10th century. A profound economic shock rippled northward from the Islamic world. Political instability and fragmentation within the Abbasid Caliphate led to a drastic reduction in silver minting. At the same time, the immensely productive silver mines in Central Asia, like those in Afghanistan, began to reach exhaustion. The great river of dirhams flowing up the Volga slowed to a trickle and then ceased entirely. This was not a minor market fluctuation, it was a systemic drought. The economic engine of the Viking world sputtered and stalled. Raiding, which was always as much a business venture as an act of war, became far less profitable. The cost and risk of mounting a long-distance expedition could no longer be guaranteed by a payoff in precious metal. You can see the archaeological signature of this collapse in the fate of the great trading centers. Birka in Sweden, once a bustling international port where Arab merchants might haggle with Norse fur traders, was abandoned by the end of the 10th century. Hedeby in Denmark, a crucial nexus, shrank and lost its cosmopolitan character, its waterfront silting up from disuse. Without the economic fuel of long-distance trade, the political landscape in Scandinavia began to solidify. Power consolidated into fewer, larger kingdoms like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. This centralization was closely tied to another profound shift, the Christianization of the region. Kings saw in the organized church a powerful tool for legitimacy and control, a new system of social glue to replace the old economy of raid and trade. The Viking Age, as a distinct era of decentralized, expansionist raider traders, did not end with a single lost battle. It faded when its primary fuel, Islamic silver, ran dry. The civilization transformed because the network that defined its possibilities contracted. This invites a stark comparison to our own time. How many nations today have built their modern identities and complex societies on the steady, abundant flow of a single global commodity, like oil? And what profound social and political transformations might follow if that flow were ever permanently disrupted? The Vikings remind us that sometimes a culture's most dynamic age ends not with conquest, but with a quiet, distant bankruptcy. The wealth of the Indian Ocean was measured in the weight of peppercorns and the scent of cloves on the wind. For a ship laden with these treasures to sail from the spice gardens of the Moluccas to the eager markets of China or the Middle East, its captain faced a simple, inescapable geographic fact. He had to pass through the narrow funnel of the Malacca Strait, and waiting there on the swampy coasts of Sumatra was a kingdom that understood power not as acres of farmland, but as control of a map. This was Srivijaya, a maritime empire built on water, its dominion defined by the ships it could tax and the harbors it could protect. Historians describe it not as a centralized state in the traditional sense, but as a fluid confederation of port cities, bound together by mutual commercial interest and a formidable navy. Its offer to passing merchants was straightforward: pay a duty for safe passage and access to Srivijaya's well-supplied harbors, or risk the pirates and treacherous seas that lay beyond its protection. This system of taxation through intimidation was brilliantly effective for centuries, turning a strategic bottleneck into a flowing river of gold and ceramics. The empire's great capital at Palembang became a legendary entrepot, a place where Chinese porcelain, Arabian glass, and Sumatran camphor met in a constant, bustling exchange. Yet an empire that exists solely to control a corridor is uniquely vulnerable to any change in the route. The first cracks were environmental. Over generations, the Musi River that gave Palembang its life began to deposit its silt around the port. The harbor, once deep and welcoming to large trading vessels, gradually grew shallower and more difficult to access. This slow, natural process weakened the primary node of the entire network. Then came a shock from across the sea. In the 11th century, the Chola Empire of southern India, a naval power in its own right, launched a series of devastating raids on Srivijaya's heartland. These were not attempts at permanent conquest, but brutal demonstrations of force. They exposed a critical weakness: Srivijaya's control depended on being the strongest navy in the strait. The Chola attacks proved that supremacy could be challenged, shattering the aura of invincibility that underpinned its taxation system. The final, decisive shift was technological and political. Chinese shipbuilding, particularly the development of massive ocean-going junks with improved navigation, began to change the calculus of trade. Some of these larger vessels started to venture on longer, open ocean routes that could, with skill, bypass the Malacca chokehold altogether. At the same time, new political powers were rising. On the island of Java, the kingdoms of Singhasari and later the mighty Majapahit Empire began to assert themselves. They controlled rich rice-growing regions, giving them an agricultural base Srivijaya always lacked, and they developed their own ports and trade relationships. The center of economic gravity in the archipelago drifted steadily eastward. A poignant testament to this reversal of fortune comes from a 14th century Javanese epic poem, the Nagaraka Tagama. It proudly lists the vast array of territories under Majapahit's sphere of influence. Srivijaya, the once dominant thalassocracy, is mentioned only in passing as a conquered dependency. It had been reduced from the gatekeeper of the seas to a footnote in a rival's chronicle. The civilization faded because it lost its singular reason for being. When ships found other paths and new powers offered better terms, the Confederation of Ports simply unraveled. Its story hangs a question over our modern world. How many nations today derive their wealth and influence primarily from their location on a vital transit corridor, a modern Strait of Malacca? Think of states whose economies hinge on a canal, a pipeline, or a digital cable landing point. Srivijaya's legacy is a timeless lesson in geographic fortune, reminding us that the value of a crossroads lasts only as long as everyone agrees to take the same road. The black glass of an obsidian blade feels cool and unnaturally sharp even after 8,000 years. This volcanic stone, born in the fiery hearts of mountains like Hasan Dag in central Anatolia, became the most sought-after material of the Neolithic world, capable of an edge finer than modern surgical steel. Its journey reveals the very origins of organized trade and how the first experiment in dense communal living rose and fell with the flow of this single resource. At the center of that story is Çatalhöyük, a sprawling settlement of mud brick houses so tightly packed that people moved across their roofs and entered their homes through holes in the ceiling. For over 1,000 years, this was not merely a village but a thriving hub. Prehistorians studying the site have uncovered its economic heartbeat, mounds of obsidian cores and flakes in various stages of work. Çatalhöyük sat in a sweet spot, close enough to the rich sources in Cappadocia to control access, and positioned to serve farming communities across the Konya Plain. It became a specialist in procurement and processing, a kind of Neolithic factory town where raw volcanic glass was shaped into prized blades, scrapers, and mirrors before being traded outward. Its unique, art-filled society, with its vivid wall paintings and intricate rituals surrounding the home, was underwritten by this sharp black currency. But a hub is only vital as long as the network has no other options. The unraveling of Çatalhöyük, beginning around 5,700 BCE, was a slow reconfiguration of that network. Environmental pressures played a role, as the demand for timber for construction and fuel from the dense population likely degraded the local woodlands, making resources scarcer. The social stresses of such crowded living, with all its ritual intensity, may have taken a toll, yet the decisive shift was economic and logistical. Over centuries, other communities learned the routes to the obsidian sources themselves, or established new trade partnerships that bypassed Çatalhöyük entirely. At the same time, alternative materials like high-quality flint from other regions entered the circulation, offering a good enough substitute for many everyday tasks. The special value of Çatalhöyük's processed obsidian began to diminish. You can see the archaeological evidence of this diffusion in the wider region. The pattern of settlement changes dramatically. The extraordinary concentration of people at Çatalhöyük gives way to a landscape dotted with smaller, more dispersed villages. These communities were more self-sufficient and less reliant on a single central place for their essential tools. They were connected, but in a looser, more resilient web. Çatalhöyük did not burn or suffer a sudden invasion. It was gradually abandoned house by house over generations. Its people did not vanish. They likely dispersed into this new, more flexible pattern of living. The unique artistic and architectural traditions that defined the settlement, like the detailed murals of wild bulls and the practice of burying the departed beneath plastered platforms in the home, faded away. The civilization of Çatalhöyük, as a distinct cultural entity, ended not with a collapse but with a dilution. Its economic reason for being had been distributed across a wider, less centralized network. This Neolithic story holds a mirror to much later patterns. What becomes of a company town when the mine closes, or a specialized manufacturing hub when the global supply chain finds a cheaper, more efficient route? Çatalhöyük's legacy is a profound lesson from the dawn of urban life, that a society built on a single, controllable niche is incredibly innovative, but also inherently transient. When the map of trade is redrawn, Even the most remarkable and artistic of communities can find its purpose quietly evaporating, leaving behind silent mounds filled with the echoes of a forgotten centrality. A city can be so mighty that its signature becomes a coveted style across a continent. In the cool highlands of central Mexico, the metropolis of Teotihuacan rose with such overwhelming presence that its very aesthetic became a language of power. For centuries, its distinctive three-temple complexes, its elegant cylindrical pottery, and its terrifying images of the storm god Tlaloc were replicated from the palaces of Maya kings to the ceremonial kivas of the ancestral Pueblones far to the north. This was not an empire built on conquest and occupation, but something more subtle and pervasive, a sprawling network of cultural influence. Teotihuacan traded in fine green obsidian, in shimmering quetzal feathers, and in precious cacao beans, but its most valuable export was prestige itself. Archaeologists describe this system as a peer polity network, where independent cities and regions engaged in a constant exchange of goods, ideas, and marriage alliances to reinforce a shared elite identity. Rulers from distant lands wanted to be associated with the cosmic authority emanating from the street of the dead. Teotihuacan's power was hegemonic, a dominant influence exerted through merchant colonies embedded in foreign cities, through royal marriages that tied distant dynasties to its legacy, and through the ever-present suggestion of its formidable military might, which could be summoned if diplomatic ties broke down. The city functioned as the spiritual and cultural capital of a vast interconnected world. Then, around the year 550, the capital of that world burned. Evidence from the site tells a story of a violent and targeted end. Great fires swept through the city's central ceremonial precinct, with particular fury directed at the temples and palaces along the main avenue. Statues were deliberately shattered and defaced. This was not the random destruction of an invading army, but something that looks like a calculated internal revolt. One leading theory suggests a dramatic uprising by the city's lower classes and outlying districts against the ruling priestly and merchant elite. The sheer scale of Teotihuacan's urban project, supporting a population that may have reached 100,000, had always been precarious. It relied on intensive agriculture and a complex web of tribute and trade. When a series of severe, prolonged droughts struck the region, this strain became intolerable. The social contract, already stretched thin by inequality, snapped. The network itself began to poison the heart. As resources dwindled, the city could no longer fulfill its role as the generous hub, the reliable source of exotic goods and divine favor for its partners. The collapse rippled outwards with devastating effect. Consider the Maya city of Tikal in present-day Guatemala. Centuries earlier, a noble with strong Teotihuacan connections had established a new dynasty there, importing the highland city's architectural styles and warfare imagery. Tikal's kings had built their legitimacy on this special connection. When Teotihuacan fell into chaos and its influence evaporated, that legitimacy was profoundly undermined. Tikal and other centers tied to the network entered a period of crisis, political instability, and warfare of their own. A poignant artifact of this systemic failure is a beautiful, distinct type of pottery known as thin orange ware. Manufactured near Teotihuacan from a unique clay, this fine, orange-colored ceramic was a luxury item traded throughout Mesoamerica, a physical token of connection to the great city. Around the mid-6th century, its production and distribution ceased completely. The workshops fell silent, and no new vessels entered the network. It is a silent archaeological signal, marking the exact moment a vast commercial and cultural circuit was switched off. The civilization of Teotihuacan did not transform or migrate. It essentially vanished, leaving its colossal pyramids to the elements. The power vacuum it left behind was filled by a new, more militaristic order, like the one that would later be led by the Toltecs. This story challenges our modern understanding of superpowers. Teotihuacan's dominance was built less on legions and tax collectors, and more on the allure of its culture, the reach of its merchants, and the fear of its distant reputation. Its collapse asks us, what holds our own global cultural network together today? Is it military alliances and trade deals, or is it something far more fragile, the shared desire for a certain lifestyle, a set of ideas, a perceived prestige? When a central cultural beacon falters, how many distant partners whose identities are intertwined with its glow might find themselves suddenly standing in the dark? A mounted courier could ride from the palaces of Susa to the shores of the Aegean in just 7 days. This was the astonishing promise of the Royal Road, the 1,500-mile administrative spine of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. More than a trade route, it was the world's first integrated information superhighway, a nervous system of empire built with meticulous precision. At regular intervals stood 111 way stations, each stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and a dedicated rider ready to take the sealed message and sprint to the next post. The system, known as the Angarium, was a logistical masterpiece designed to make the vastness of the empire manageable, to turn distant provinces into responsive limbs of a single imperial body. Historians of administration point out that this network did far more than move goods, it moved authority. Standardized units of measurement along the road ensured fair trade from Egypt to India, while the constant flow of royal decrees and intelligence reports allowed the great king in Persepolis to govern with an awareness no previous ruler had ever possessed. The Persian Empire was not held together by ideology alone, but by the relentless, rhythmic beat of hooves on a well-maintained road. Yet a nervous system is only as healthy as the body it serves. The collapse of this magnificent network did not begin with the armies of Alexander the Great crossing into Anatolia. It began with a slow, internal corrosion, a failure of maintenance and trust that left the empire's arteries dangerously clogged. Over generations, the powerful provincial governors, known as satraps, grew increasingly autonomous. Corruption seeped into the system as local elites prioritized their own wealth over imperial cohesion. Taxes meant for the royal treasury were siphoned off, and the vital maintenance of roads and way stations became a lower priority. Information, the lifeblood of the empire, began to flow sluggishly, or was distorted by officials seeking to hide their failings from the center. The central government, overextended and increasingly detached, lost its grip on the very mechanisms of control it had invented. You can see the fatal result of this decay in a single, pivotal moment, the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE. Darius III, the Great King, mobilized a colossal army to crush Alexander's invasion, but the legendary Persian logistics faltered. The mustering of troops from across the empire was slower and less coordinated than it should have been. Supply lines dependent on those now neglected roads were strained. When Darius faced Alexander on the narrow coastal plain, his very numbers became a disadvantage, a tangled, poorly communicated mass. The system that was designed to bring the empire's full force to bear with speed and precision instead delivered a force that was cumbersome and slow to react. Alexander's smaller, more agile army exploited this weakness perfectly. The Achaemenid Empire did not fall because its roads were destroyed by an invader, but because they had already fallen into disrepair from within. The civilization, as a unified administrative entity, vanished when the trust and efficiency that flowed along those roads evaporated long before the final military defeat. This invites a sobering reflection on the nature of any large institution, ancient or modern. What happens to a nation, a corporation, or even a global alliance when its internal lines of communication break down? When local interests consistently override collective good, and the regular, honest reports that allow for wise governance are replaced by silence or misinformation. The story of the Royal Road is a timeless lesson in infrastructure. reminding us that the most brilliant systems are built not just of stone and station, but of shared purpose and relentless upkeep. Without that, the message simply stops moving and the center is left in the dark, waiting for a storm it can no longer see coming. The frantic smelting of bronze weapons could not save them. As the so-called Sea People's Crisis engulfed the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, kingdoms from Greece to Egypt scrambled to arm their soldiers. But the real crisis began not with invaders, but with a silent, distant failure in the trade of a single critical metal, tin. This silvery metal, when alloyed with copper, creates bronze, the very foundation of the age. Yet tin was astonishingly rare. Its sources guarded trade secrets scattered from the mountains of Afghanistan to the distant shores of Cornwall in Britain. The late Bronze Age collapse was history's first documented failure of a globalized system, a stark lesson in how interconnected civilizations can fall together. This was not the fall of one empire, but the catastrophic unraveling of an entire international network, a domino effect where the failure of one node triggered collapse across the map. At the heart of this network was a delicate, long-distance dance between raw materials. Copper, mined in bulk on Cyprus, was shipped east and west. Tin, the indispensable but scarce partner, traveled even farther. Kingdoms like the Hittites in Anatolia and the Mycenaeans in Greece were not self-sufficient. Their power rested on palaces that functioned as redistribution centers, taking in imported metals, luxury goods, and food, and sending out finished products, soldiers, and diplomatic gifts. This was a system of profound interdependence. A letter from a Hittite king to his counterpart in Assyria, preserved on a clay tablet, might request an emergency shipment of iron, a metal even rarer than tin at the time. The entire political and economic order was a web of such requests and agreements, a fragile equilibrium maintained through constant exchange. Then, multiple shocks hit the system simultaneously. Climate data from the period suggests a prolonged series of severe droughts that devastated agricultural yields from the Greek mainland to the Levant. At the same time, evidence points to a possible wave of earthquakes that damaged key coastal cities and ports. These environmental crises created famine, social unrest, and massive, destabilizing movements of people. The migrations later recorded by Egyptian scribes as the invasions of the Sea Peoples. But the killing blow was the severing of the trade routes themselves, as piracy and insecurity made the seas treacherous, and as partner kingdoms turned inward to deal with their own crises, the long-distance shipments of tin and copper ground to a halt. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic for the palatial kingdoms. Without tin, you cannot make bronze. Without bronze, you cannot forge new weapons, repair tools, or cast ceremonial objects. The very material basis of military power, economic production, and royal authority literally vanished. We can see the administrative collapse in the silence of the written record. In Greece, the Linear B script, used solely for palace inventories and records, disappears completely. In the Levant, the dense diplomatic correspondence in cuneiform between kings ceases. When the long-distance trade that required such meticulous accounting stopped, the bureaucracy itself became pointless. The palaces were not conquered so much as they were switched off, their reason for existing gone. A single shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Uluburun in Turkey, serves as a perfect time capsule of this lost world and its peril. The vessel was a floating testament to late Bronze Age globalization, carrying a staggering cargo: 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, a ton of tin ingots, blue glass from Mesopotamia, ebony and ivory from Africa, and amber from the Baltic. This one ship connected at least 7 different cultures. Its loss on the seabed is a powerful symbol of the risk inherent in such complex, far-flung exchanges. When the network is healthy, it brings unparalleled wealth. When it fails, it can take entire civilizations down with it. The Hittite Empire, a formidable rival to Egypt, vanished so completely that its very location was forgotten for millennia. The Mycenaean palaces were abandoned, their people dispersing into smaller, simpler villages. This was not a transformation but a full reset. It forces a deeply uncomfortable reflection on our own hyper-connected world. We too have built a system of astonishing interdependence, where a disruption in one corner of the globe can cascade through supply chains, financial markets, and energy grids. The Bronze Age collapse asks us, what are our equivalent of the tin trade? Which scarce critical resources or which vital lines of communication hold our modern network together? And what would happen if several major shocks, climatic, political, technological, arrived at once, testing the resilience of that web? The silence that fell over the eastern Mediterranean 3,000 years ago is a haunting reminder that interconnectivity is both a civilization's greatest strength and, under pressure, its most profound vulnerability. The scent of fermenting grapes along the Moselle River once carried all the way to the damp forts of Roman Britain. For centuries, the empire's taste for wine fueled a thriving commercial artery down the Rhine, with pottery amphorae clinking in the holds of river barges as they moved north. Then, in the 5th century, that steady flow of goods and coins began to slow, not to a trickle, but into a new and different pattern. This transformation forces us to rethink the very idea of a dark age. It was not an era of no trade, but of a radically simplified and localized commerce, a profound economic contraction that reshaped civilization itself. Archaeologists studying the layers of early medieval settlements see this story in the soil. The distinctive, mass-produced African red slip pottery, a fine tableware found from Britain to Syria during Roman times, vanishes from sites across Europe after the 5th century. Its disappearance is a silent signal, marking the end of a continent-wide industrial ceramic network. The long-distance shipment of bulk goods like wine, olive oil, and grain, which had been the lifeblood of Roman urban life, largely ceased. The complex monetary economy that facilitated it, with its standardized coinage and credit systems, fragmented. Without the security of Roman roads and patrols, and with river and sea routes grown perilous from instability and piracy, the risks of moving heavy, cheap commodities simply became too great. What emerged in its place was a new economic logic, one built on self-sufficiency and personal obligation. The manor, or large estate, became the primary economic unit, producing almost everything its community needed locally. Transport shifted from the ceramic amphora to the wooden barrel, a technology better suited to smaller, more irregular shipments along compromised routes. But trade did not disappear, it changed its nature. Long-distance exchange became mostly about prestige, not subsistence. Elite warriors and kings traded in luxury items, fine weapons, jewelry, and exotic textiles, often through a gift economy that cemented political alliances rather than generating commercial profit. A Frankish lord might drink local ale from a wooden cup, saving his prized silver goblet, acquired through a far-off alliance for ceremonial display. This contraction from a complex, integrated network to a simplified, localized one is itself a form of civilizational change. The classical civilization of Western Europe, with its cosmopolitan cities and impersonal markets, did not just decline, it transformed into a patchwork of smaller-scale societies operating on fundamentally different principles. The economic horizon shrank from the Mediterranean to the neighboring valley. This shift invites a challenging reflection for our own globally integrated age. In a major, prolonged crisis, which layers of our intricate supply chains might prove most fragile? What aspects of our economy, currently dependent on constant long-distance flows, could revert to localization or simplification? The early medieval world shows us that civilization is not a single peak, but a landscape of possible adaptations, and sometimes the path forward involves learning how to live well within a much smaller circle. A golden passport could once carry a merchant from Venice to Beijing under a single, terrifying guarantee. This was the Pesa, a tablet of authority issued by the Mongol Khans, and it symbolized the greatest paradox of the medieval world. The same horse armies that conquered with legendary brutality also forged, for nearly a century, an unprecedented peace across the entire Eurasian continent. Historians call this era the Pax Mongolica, and it created the Silk Road's final, dazzling golden age. For the first time in history, a merchant could travel on secure, well-maintained roads from the shores of the Black Sea to the capital of China, encountering not a patchwork of warring states, but a unified commercial empire. The Mongol destruction of existing borders had, ironically, built the world's first truly integrated economic space, a precursor to what scholars like Janet Abu-Lughod describe as an early form of globalization. The flow of goods, technologies, and ideas accelerated to a breathtaking pace. Persian astronomical charts reached Beijing, Chinese gunpowder recipes traveled west, and Venetian traders like the Polo family could establish direct connections with the court of Kublai Khan. This network was the ultimate top-down creation, a system of exchange built not on mutual agreement, but on the absolute, enforced will of a single superpower. Yet a system born from conquest is only as stable as the empire that enforces it. The collapse of this Mongol-facilitated network was not a single event, but a convergence of catastrophes, both biological and political. The first and most devastating was the Black Death in the 14th century. The very efficiency of the Mongol trade routes became their undoing, as fleas carrying the plague bacterium traveled in the saddlebags of traders and the holds of ships with terrifying speed. The disease swept from China to Europe, leading to profound loss of life and crippling the economies that depended on dense populations and skilled labor. The great caravanserais fell silent, not by decree but from emptiness. At the same time, the political unity of the Mongol Empire fractured. The vast realm split into rival khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. These successor states began to war with each other, turning the once secure internal highways into contested battlefields. The safe passage guaranteed by the Golden Pesa became a memory. The final severing of the overland routes came from new powers rising at the network's edges. In the West, the Ottoman Empire's expansion eventually blocked European access to the Silk Road's western termini, capturing Constantinople in 1453. In the East, a profound policy shift occurred under China's new Ming dynasty. After initial maritime expeditions under Admiral Zheng He, which explored the Indian Ocean, the Ming court deliberately turned inward, adopting an isolationist stance. They abandoned the overland steppe routes of their Mongol predecessors and focused on defending their own borders. The combined effect was to make the Silk Road not just dangerous, but obsolete for European merchants seeking the riches of the East. Consider the legacy of Marco Polo. The routes he described in such detail in the 13th century became impassable myths within 100 years of his passing. The world he knew had been a fleeting moment of connection, a window that opened under a Mongol peace and then slammed shut. This raises a reflective question for our own era of globalization. How much of our interconnected world relies not on organic cooperation, but on the stability and enforced order of a hegemonic power? The Pax Mongolica stands as a stark lesson that the most efficient global network can be astonishingly fragile. It vanishes when the central authority fragments, when disease exploits its connections, or when the political will to maintain it simply evaporates. The peace bought by force, it seems, lasts only as long as the empire can keep its golden promises. The largest earthwork north of Mexico rises from the Illinois floodplain, a colossal pyramid of packed soil that took 300 years to build. Monk's Mound at Cahokia was the heart of a bustling city, home to perhaps 20,000 people at its peak around the year 1100. This was the apex of the Mississippian world, a vast cultural network bound together not by written decrees, but by a shared reverence for the sun, a dependence on maize, and a thriving commerce in objects of sacred power. From the Great Lakes came gleaming copper, hammered into ceremonial plates. From the Gulf of Mexico arrived intricate cups and beads carved from the luminous inner layer of marine conch shells. These were not mere decorations, they were the physical tokens of a spiritual and political order. Cahokia functioned as what some anthropologists call a theater of power. Here, in a grand plaza facing the Great Mound, rulers would stage elaborate rituals, redistributing these exotic goods to local chieftains who journeyed from distant towns. In receiving a shell gorget or a copper ornament, an ally was not just getting a gift, he was being woven into the fabric of a cosmology that centered on Cahokia itself. The city's influence pulsed outward along the river highways, connecting communities across the mid-continent in a common cultural language. Their flourishing, however, was built on a delicate environmental balance. Then the climate shifted. Beginning in the 13th century, a period often referred to as the Little Ice Age brought cooler, wetter conditions to North America. For the farmers of the Mississippi floodplain, this was a disaster in slow motion. The shorter, cooler growing seasons stressed the maize crops that provided the essential food surplus needed to feed Cahokia's non-farming elite, its priests, and its mound-building laborers. Worse, the increased rainfall led to more frequent and severe floods, washing away fields and silting up the vital backwater lakes that were rich in fish and waterfowl. The agricultural foundation of the entire chiefdom began to crumble. As harvests grew unreliable, the social contract strained to breaking point. The central authority, which had justified its rule through the distribution of food and sacred goods during grand festivals, could no longer deliver. Evidence from the site suggests rising conflict, perhaps even internal revolt. The once grand wooden stockade that surrounded the central precinct was rebuilt multiple times, each version larger and more formidable, signaling a society turning inward for protection. The trade network, dependent on Cahokia's stability and generosity, began to fray. Local elites in outlying towns, unable to secure the shell and copper symbols of their status from a weakened center, sought other sources of legitimacy or simply saw their own power wane. The great theater was closing. By the middle of the 14th century, the stage was empty. Cahokia's population dispersed, not in a single exodus, but in a gradual migration to smaller, more defensible villages up and down the river valleys. The knowledge of large-scale mound construction, a tradition that required coordinated labor and a surplus of food, faded from memory. Across the region, the unified Mississippian artistic style fragmented into local variations. The civilization did not end with conquest, it dissolved through dispersal, as the central place that gave the network its meaning and purpose could no longer hold. This story of a capital whose light slowly dimmed invites a quiet reflection. How many political and cultural capitals throughout history, and even today, derive their influence primarily from their role as a redistributor, a stage manager for the economy of prestige? When such a hub can no longer perform that core function, whether from environmental stress, economic failure, or lost credibility, what happens to the wider network of communities that look to it for direction and identity? The silent mounds along the Mississippi stand as earthen monuments to a simple truth, that the power to gather people is often the first thing lost when the harvest fails. The thunder of hooves across the desert was a sound of wealth in motion. At the great seasonal fairs like that of Nadran, the true currency was not gold, but the living, breathing perfection of an Arabian horse. For centuries, the vast cultural and economic network of the Bedouin tribes was woven from threads of biological capital, the breeding and exchange of horses, camels, and the elegant Saluki hunting hounds. This was a mobile civilization whose deepest knowledge was not of ledgers, but of bloodlines, water sources, and the subtle lines of a perfect conformation. Ethnographers who have studied this tradition note that these animals were never mere property. A prized mare was a character in tribal poetry, her genealogy recited alongside that of human ancestors, her exchange a ritual that cemented alliances and settled disputes between clans. The network was invisible on any map of cities, yet it was vast, defined by the Dera, the recognized tribal territory, and the ancient migration routes followed with the seasons. Its strength was its self-sufficiency and its profound adaptation to an extreme environment. This equestrian world, however, did not collapse in the traditional sense. It was gradually absorbed and made obsolete by two transformative waves, one spiritual and political, the other technological. The first great transformation came with the rise and expansion of Islam. The unification of the Arabian Peninsula under the early caliphates created a vast, standardized imperial market. While demand for Arabian horses soared, supplying the cavalry of a world empire, the trade was now tied to the needs and regulations of Damascus or Baghdad. The deeply personal, tribal character of the exchange, where a horse's history was a story known by all, began to dilute within the impersonal scale of imperial commerce. The final, decisive shift was centuries later, with the arrival of the petroleum age and the modern nation-state in the 20th century. The internal combustion engine delivered a quiet, devastating blow to the very purpose of the network. The automobile and the truck rendered the camel caravan and the horse-borne warrior economically irrelevant for transport and warfare almost overnight. At the same time, new international borders, drawn with straight lines across maps in distant capitals, sliced ruthlessly through the traditional Dera and severed the seasonal migration routes that were the lifeblood of pastoral life. Consider the profound transformation of the annual Hajj pilgrimage. For over a millennium, the journey to Mecca was a pinnacle event for camel breeders and traders, who supplied the thousands of animals needed for the caravan routes across the desert. Today, that same movement of people is facilitated by jets, buses, and modern logistics companies. The specialized knowledge of raising, training, and trading camels for this specific purpose became a historical footnote. The Bedouin civilization, as a self-sufficient network built on equestrian nomadism, did not vanish into sand, but into the grid of the modern world state system. Its people and their descendants are part of the contemporary Middle East, but the autonomous, animal-based economic web that defined their sovereignty and cultural identity has largely receded. This invites a quiet reflection on the pace of obsolescence. What entire ecosystems of traditional knowledge, from celestial navigation to seasonal foraging, have been rendered peripheral by a single technological leap? The story of the Arabian horse trade reminds us that some networks fade not because they fail, but because the world around them changes its fundamental language, leaving a beautiful and intricate way of life speaking in a dialect few still remember. The call to prayer echoing through a coral stone mosque in Kilwa-Kisiwani was a sound of fusion. For centuries, the Swahili coast was a vibrant cultural and economic seam, where the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean stitched together two worlds. African gold, ivory, and timber from the vast interior met Chinese porcelain, Indian cottons, and Persian glass on these shores, creating a unique civilization of stone towns. The Swahili were not colonizers of the hinterland, but brilliant cultural brokers. As historian Chapuruka Kusimba describes, they built a string of independent, cosmopolitan city-states, from Mogadishu to Sofala, that thrived on connection. Their society was a synthesis, a Bantu African foundation overlaid with Islamic architectural styles, Arabic script for their language, and a mercantile outlook shaped by the rhythms of the sea. Their power was soft, built on negotiation, marriage alliances with inland chiefs, and the irresistible appeal of the exotic goods they could offer. The stone houses and grand mosques were not symbols of military might, but of commercial success and a sophisticated urban identity. This delicate, ocean-focused network, however, was perfectly positioned for a catastrophic collision with a new kind of power. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean with a singular, brutal goal: to seize control of the spice trade by force. They did not come to join the existing network, but to smash and replace it. In 1505, the Portuguese fleet attacked and sacked the magnificent city of Teotihuacan. They stormed the palace, looted its wealth, and installed a puppet ruler. The same fate befell Mombasa and other prosperous towns. This was not a temporary raid, it was a systemic assault on the very model of Swahili commerce. The Portuguese built fortified outposts like Fort Jesus in Mombasa, and demanded exorbitant taxes from any ship not bearing their license. The free-flowing, monsoon-driven trade that had nourished Swahili culture for 600 years was choked by cannon and coercion. The great Husuni Kubwa Palace in Kilwa, with its over 100 rooms, audience courts, and a grand swimming pool, stands as a silent witness to this rupture. After the Portuguese attack, this sprawling complex, once the heart of a thriving mercantile elite, was abandoned. It became a monument to a trade-based golden age that had ended abruptly. The Portuguese disruption was followed by another imperial wave. Omani Arabs pushed them out of many areas by the late 17th century, but this was not a return to the old ways. The Omani exerted a more direct political and economic control, shifting the focus of trade to their own possessions, like Zanzibar. The final transformation came with the high tide of European colonialism in the 19th century. British and German interests redirected African trade toward the Atlantic, integrating the region into a global system that bypassed the old Indian Ocean networks entirely. The classical Swahili civilization, as an independent network of merchant republics governing their own destiny, did not slowly fade. It was dismantled by successive imperial competitions that had no use for its sophisticated brokerage role. Its legacy lives on in language, architecture, and culture, but its political and economic sovereignty vanished under the weight of larger forces. This history makes us look at modern port cities in a new light. How many of today's global hubs, from Singapore to Rotterdam, have built their identities on a similar genius for connection and exchange? And how vulnerable is that identity to a sudden shift in the geopolitical winds, or to a new power deciding to control the sea lanes by a different, more forceful set of rules? The coral ruins of Kilwa whisper that the most cosmopolitan of cultures can sometimes be the most fragile when the rules of the game change from commerce to conquest. The blinding white glare of the salt slabs was a sight born of pure desperation. In the heart of the Sahara, a place existed where the currency of life was traded for the substance of life itself. This was Taghaza, a settlement so desolate and essential that its very buildings were constructed from blocks of salt, the only material available in that waterless, scorching plain. Here, in conditions historians describe as among the most severe on earth, enslaved workers mined the precious slabs that would be loaded onto camels for the long, perilous journey south. Salt was not a luxury here, it was a biological necessity, traded ounce for ounce with the gold of the West African empires. Taghaza became a ghostly paradox, a town of immense strategic value owned by no kingdom, yet perpetually contested by the empires of Mali and later Songhai, who fought not for land but for control of this brutal faucet of wealth. The civilization of the salt miners was a specialized, harsh society existing at the very edge of human endurance, entirely dependent on a constant influx of supplies and labor from the outside world. Its existence proved a single stark point. Some settlements are not built to last, they are built to be consumed. And in the 16th century, the market simply chose a new place to consume. The Abandonment of Taghaza is a masterclass in economic obsolescence. The salt did not run out. Instead, new mines were opened at Taoyuani, located further to the east. This new source offered a superior quality of salt, and its location better aligned with the shifting political and commercial gravity of the rising Songhai Empire and its great trading city of Gao. Simultaneously, the increasing danger from Berber raiders along the traditional caravan routes made the old path to Taghaza a gamble too costly to take. One by one, the great caravans changed their course. The lifeblood of Taghaza, the flow of goods and forced labor, slowed and then stopped. Without that constant replenishment, the settlement could not sustain itself for a single season. The result was not a battle or a slow decline, but a swift, silent reclamation. The desert, which had been held at bay by the sheer force of human need, simply moved back in. The salt block houses, the tools, the very footprints of the miners were left to the wind. Taghaza literally evaporated from the map, leaving behind only crystalline ruins as a monument to a trade that had moved on. This forces a chilling reflection on the nature of extraction. How many modern communities, from mining towns to offshore rigs, are modern-day Taghazas? Their entire reason for being is tied to a single, non-renewable resource or a specific logistical pathway. Their societies are engineered for that one purpose, often at great human and environmental cost. And what becomes of them when the resource is depleted, when a cheaper alternative is found, or when the global market simply redraws the map of necessity? The salt miners of the Sahara did not vanish because they failed at their task. Their specialized civilization ended because the world found a slightly better route, rendering a century of brutal toil and a settlement built of salt itself into a footnote in the ledger of trade. That intricate calligraphy was more than beautiful art. It was the physical form of a conversation spanning continents and centuries. In the great libraries of Baghdad and Damascus, you could find the medical theories of Galen transcribed in Arabic next to the mathematical proofs from India and the star charts of ancient Persia. This was the lifeblood of the Islamic Golden Age, a civilization whose highest achievement was not a monument of stone, but a sprawling, dynamic network for trading knowledge itself. The real infrastructure of this intellectual empire was built from paper and ink. Historians of science point to a quiet revolution, the widespread adoption of paper-making technology from China. State-supported paper mills sprang up across the caliphate, making the material for books affordable and abundant in a way parchment never could. This technological leap fueled institutions like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a grand translating house and academy where teams of scholars worked to render the world's knowledge into Arabic. Ideas became mobile. A physician from Cordoba could cite a Persian chemist's work, and an astronomer in Cairo could build upon observations from Central Asia. The network thrived on the movement of people, the itinerant scholars who carried manuscripts from one learning center to another, creating a shared, evolving library of human understanding. The genius of this system was its connectivity, but a network of ideas is only as strong as the political and social peace that allows scholars to travel and letters to flow. That peace shattered in the 13th century. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had provided a unifying framework, fragmented under pressure from rival powers. While new centers of learning blossomed in Cairo under the Fatimids and in Cordoba under the Umayyads, they often operated as separate spheres, competing for prestige rather than collaborating as parts of a whole. The catastrophic fracture came in the year 1258, when Mongol forces besieged and sacked Baghdad. The devastation was cultural as much as it was physical. Contemporary accounts describe the Tigris River running black with ink from the countless manuscripts thrown from the city's libraries. many scholars lost their lives, and the great translating houses were reduced to rubble. The central hub of the network was violently destroyed, while knowledge itself survived, scattered to corners like Persia, Syria, and North Africa. The cohesive, collaborative system that had driven such rapid innovation was broken. The pathways for exchange were now longer, more dangerous, and subject to new political barriers. You can see this fragmentation in the curious journey of a single book, Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine. This monumental work synthesized Greek and Islamic medical knowledge into a single, authoritative text. It became a foundational textbook in Europe for centuries, not because it flowed seamlessly from Baghdad, but because it was translated into Latin in the 12th century in Sicily and Toledo, places on the very fringe of the old Arabic knowledge network, after the heart of that network had been damaged. The translation was a salvage operation, recovering a treasure from a system that was no longer functioning as it once had. The pace of collective discovery slowed. Without the constant, facilitated exchange between centers, insights could languish in isolation for generations. The Golden Age, as a unified, network-driven project, faded not because people became less intelligent, but because the channels for sharing that intelligence were severed or heavily taxed. This history holds up a mirror to our own digital age of information. We too have built a breathtaking network for the trade of knowledge, one that moves at the speed of light. But how much do we take its openness and connectivity for granted? What political, economic, or even technological forces could today fracture our global conversation, leaving future scholars to piece together our insights from scattered, isolated servers? The silent libraries of Baghdad remind us that the greatest threat to a renaissance is not the loss of ideas, but the loss of the connections between them. The harbor at Novgorod was a forest of single masts, each flying the red and white banners of a city hundreds of miles away. These were the cogs of the Hanseatic League, sturdy merchant ships that carried the lifeblood of medieval northern Europe, Baltic furs, Russian wax, and Norwegian stockfish, south to the wealthy markets of Flanders and England. For over 3 centuries, this was not an empire, but something far more innovative, a decentralized commercial confederation. It was a network built on a revolutionary idea that mutual profit could be a stronger bond than feudal loyalty. At its heart were the Kontur fortified trading posts that operated like independent embassies of commerce in foreign cities. The London Steelyard, the Bergen Briggen, the Novgorod Peterhof, these were more than warehouses. They were self-governing compounds where Hanseatic merchants lived under their own laws, judged their own disputes, and negotiated as a powerful, unified bloc with kings and princes. Their strength was their collective bargaining power and their control of the sea lanes, turning the Baltic into what some historians call a Hanse lake. This was the last and greatest breath of a purely medieval economic order, a world where merchant guilds could rival the authority of crowns. But a network built on commercial privilege is uniquely vulnerable to the rise of a new kind of power, the sovereign territorial state. From the 15th century onward, the League faced a slow squeeze from all sides. In the West, the kings of England and the dukes of Burgundy grew increasingly resentful of the Hanse's special tax exemptions and legal autonomy within their realms. They saw these foreign merchants not as vital partners, but as a state within a state, draining wealth and flouting royal authority. To the east, a newly assertive Russia, consolidated under Moscow, began to push back against the League's influence in Novgorod, seeking to control its own trade routes. Perhaps the most symbolic blow came from the sea itself. The great age of Atlantic exploration opened new routes to the riches of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The economic center of gravity in Europe began to shift decisively from the enclosed Baltic and North Seas to the open Atlantic. The ports of Antwerp, and later Amsterdam and London, thrived on this new global trade, while the traditional Hanseatic hubs like Lübeck and Danzig found themselves on the periphery of a redrawn economic map. Internal strains pulled the League apart at the seams. The Black Death had ravaged the population of Northern Europe, disrupting markets and labor and creating new social tensions. Wealthier member cities began to pursue their own interests, leading to conflicts that the League's loose council could not resolve. The final act of this long decline can be seen in the fate of the London Steelyard. For centuries, this walled compound on the Thames had been a bustling hub, its merchants enjoying ancient rights granted by medieval kings. But in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a monarch fiercely protective of English sovereignty and commercial ambition, those privileges were abruptly revoked. The Steelyard was closed, its special status erased. The message was clear: the age of autonomous merchant republics operating within powerful kingdoms was over. The modern nation-state had arrived, and it would brook no rival networks. The Hanseatic League did not fall in a war, it was simply made irrelevant. Its cooperative model was absorbed or dismantled by states that now understood trade as an arm of national policy, not a private guild affair. This history whispers a question to our own era of continental unions and global trade agreements. How do today's intricate economic blocs, built on treaties and shared regulations, fare when the winds of nationalism rise and sovereign states decide to reclaim control of their own commercial destiny? The ghostly cogs in Novgorod's harbor remind us that the most successful networks are often dismantled not by failure, but by a fundamental change in the idea of who gets to write the rules. The stone faces gazing from the cliffs of Bamiyan wore the serene smile of the Buddha, yet their features were carved with the elegant, naturalistic grace of a Greek god. This impossible fusion was born in a mountain pass, a 50-kilometer gash in the Hindu Kush known as the Khyber. For over 2,000 years, this narrow corridor was not a barrier but a conduit, one of the most critical choke points on the entire Silk Road. Every caravan of spices heading west, every army of ambition heading east, had to squeeze through its rocky defiles. But something remarkable happened in the fertile valleys on either side of this pass, in the ancient region of Gandhara. Here, the constant flow did not just move goods, it catalyzed a civilization. Gandhara became a living experiment, a cultural melting pot where the philosophical depth of Indian Buddhism met the artistic genius of the Hellenistic world, left behind by Alexander the Great's expeditions centuries earlier. Art historians describe the statues and reliefs from centers like Taxila and Hadda as a silent conversation in stone. The Buddha is depicted in the draped robes of a Roman philosopher, his curls arranged like the hair of Apollo, yet his posture and mudras speak a purely Indian spiritual language. Monasteries thrived as international centers of learning, funded by the generous donations of wealthy merchants who prayed for safe passage through the mountains ahead. The prosperity of Gandhara was entirely a product of transit, a brilliant bloom nurtured by the endless stream of travelers. This delicate hybrid world, however, existed at the mercy of the pass it depended on. The same geography that made it a crossroads also made it a target. In the 5th and 6th centuries, a new force emerged from the Central Asian steppes, the Hephthalites, often called the White Huns. They were not traders but raiders, and they saw the wealthy valleys of Gandhara not as a partner in exchange, but as a prize to be plundered. Their invasions were violently destructive, targeting the very heart of Gandharan society. Monastic universities were sacked and burned, their libraries of Sanskrit and Prakrit manuscripts lost to fire. The sophisticated urban centers, whose economies were intertwined with long-distance caravans, were ravaged. The artistic workshops where Greek and Indian masters had collaborated fell silent. This physical destruction was compounded by a profound spiritual and economic shift. Buddhism, which had been the dominant faith and the patron of Gandhara's glorious art, began to recede in the region under pressure from a resurgent Hinduism and later the spread of Islam. Simultaneously, the broader map of Eurasian trade was changing. As security collapsed along the Central Silk Road, merchants increasingly sought alternative paths, sending their goods on northern routes across the steppe or opting for the growing maritime networks of the Indian Ocean. The Khyber Pass, once throbbing with commercial life, became a backwater of conflict and instability. You can witness the echo of this ancient loss in a modern tragedy. The colossal Buddhas of Bamiyan, standing in a valley just to the west of Gandhara proper, were late masterpieces of this syncretic tradition. Their deliberate destruction in 2001 was a stark repetition of the same pattern that erased Gandharan culture 15 centuries earlier, the use of the past not for cultural exchange, but for the imposition of a single, uncompromising vision. After the Hephthalite invasions, cities like Taxila and Peshawar never regained their cosmopolitan character. They were rebuilt, of course, but as fortresses or provincial towns in new empires. The unique alchemy that had blended philosophies and art styles dissipated, its ingredients scattered. The civilization did not transform, it was simply switched off, its economic and cultural circuits severed. This forces a quiet reflection on the nature of our own global crossroads. Think of the world's great international hubs from Dubai to Singapore, places whose entire identity is built on openness, transit, and the free blending of people and ideas. How deeply is their vibrant character dependent on a sustained peace and a commitment to exchange over conquest? Gandhara stands as a poignant monument to a fragile truth, that the most beautifully mixed cultures often grow in the most precarious places, flourishing only as long as the pass remains open for dialogue, not for the march of armies.